The one thing I want to point out, it's an incredibly exhausting time, and I don't mean that in a negative or positive way. It's a lot.
In the past 2 weeks, I've probably seen as much death as I've seen in the past 3 years. It's bad. It's really sad.
I feel like over the past month or so, a lot of us have been through so much. We've virtually had to, change our lives around. Everything's been flipped upside down, and we've had to change our routines, which can be pretty tough. We've had to stay at home, socially distance, and for some of us, washing our hands has been a real change in routine as well.
This is me checking into a hotel room for the next 14 days in order to minimize the risk to my husband and children from me being exposed at work. I have my cooler that my husband packed me some meals that I can heat up here. And I brought my iPad so that I can FaceTime my kids. With the expected peak in California, expected anytime now this coming week, we determined it was just a better idea for our family right now that I stay in the housing.
Our emergency department is turned into an ICU. Essentially, half the hospital is turned into an ICU. What normally goes into like a small area of the hospital comparatively to the rest of the hospital is now essentially the entire hospital.
We just finished rounding on all of our patients in the COVID-19 intensive care unit. I can tell you they're sick. Many of them are not doing well, but some are turning around, and that's incredibly reassuring. The big difference that we're feeling is that we're not just caring for the patients, but we're all just needing to check in on each other. And every single staff member, from respiratory therapist to nurse to doctor, we're just always making sure that we're doing okay. So in a time like this, it's just great to see that humanity is put first.
Please just remember that the more people go out and do their own thing and ignore the stay at home, the safe at home, the orders to help all of us flatten the curve, the longer you go out there, the longer I have to stay in here, the longer I have to be away from my family, the longer all of us have to deal with a completely changed world. So please, every time you get ready to walk out the door, think about those of us that can't walk in ours, and think if it's really necessary.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.